and we're going to keep this going because I am so honored to be able to introduce our next speaker. We have Dr. Bernice King joining us today. We're sitting right in front of the historical Martin Luther King Center. Please give a round of applause for the CEO of the King Center, Dr. Bernice King.
Good afternoon, everybody. 58 years ago, my father delivered his now iconic "I Have a Dream" speech. He reminded this nation of its obligations to deliver on its promise of freedom and justice for its black citizens. He reminded us of the fierce urgency of now and that this was no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or taking the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Although the Voting Rights Act was signed into law 2 years later as a result of pressure from we, the people, who would have ever thought that 50 plus years later we would still be fighting for the protection of voting rights and equal access to the ballot. This time, though, we are not just fighting for voting rights, we are fighting to literally save our democracy from those who would attempt to root our nation in the oppressive weeds of yesterday through a new generation of Jim Crow voting laws. Rather than sowing seeds to provide democracy, the greatest chance to grow today and prevail tomorrow, state legislators across this nation are attempting to transport us back to the shameful period of American history when mass voter suppression for the black community was the law of the land. Only this time, the impact has far-reaching effects on all communities of color, rural communities, economically marginalized communities, and young voters. On this, the 58th anniversary of the March on Washington, and my father's "I Have a Dream" speech, it is a tragedy that our nation still embraces exclusion and tolerates disenfranchisement. What has and is being done in the name of voting disregards and disrespects the tireless work of my father and so many other people. It jeopardizes the soul of our nation and the promise of democracy. We are in a state of emergency, and it will be fatal for the nation, just as my father said in '63, to overlook the urgency of this critical moment around voting rights. Therefore, I'm here today because I care about the life of our democracy and our humanity. I'm here because there's a major assault on the crown of my father's life work, voting rights. I'm here because many state legislative halls of the South still have those whose lips drip with the words of interposition and nullification. And I'm here because we are in the fight of our lifetime, and justice is still lying prostrate on the floor of too many Senate houses across this country and on the floor of our U.S. Senate. And we must resuscitate it through strong, aggressive, moral, and courageous leadership from our president, vice president, and members of the Senate, who are determined to pass voter legislation, even if it means abolishing the filibuster to save our democracy in this hour. As my father said, there comes a time when one must take a position that is neither safe, nor politic, nor popular, but he or she must take that position because conscience tells them it is right. Therefore, we say to our Senate that voting rights is not an ephemeral, evanescent domestic issue that can be kicked about by reactionary guardians of the status quo. It is rather an eternal moral issue which may well determine the destiny of our nation. The hour is late. The clock of destiny is ticking out, and we must act now before it's too late. The most significant threat to our democracy is principled men and women's voices remaining silent on this issue and failing to yield to conscience by standing against laws that restrict access to voting. As freedom-loving people who are gathered here today, and all across this nation, we refuse to be silent or silenced by anyone or any means. No democracy or truth-seeking individual, and I must say even corporation in this country, should silence their conscience when injustice rears its ugly head, because justice and righteousness is everybody's business. And all freedom-loving people must let their dissatisfaction be known. So we can never be satisfied. As long as voting rights continues to be a political football in the hands of men and women who utilize their legislative powers to write and pass laws that restrict and streamline free access to the ballot. We can never be satisfied as long as our democracy is under threat by those who feel that their election to office grants them the right to remove power from state elected officials and local election boards to determine the outcomes of elections and substitute the counting of one person, one vote with the decision of a legislative body. We cannot be satisfied as long as black and brown and young and impoverished people are targets of political operatives. We cannot be satisfied, and we won't be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Therefore, we call on our corporate, our faith, our civic, our entertainment communities to use your influence to retire propagandized politics in the state legislators across this nation and apply pressure on President Biden, Vice President Harris, and members of the Senate so that we can get passed and signed into law the John Lewis Voter Advancement Act and For the People Act. Yes, it was a win for democracy when people turned out in record numbers in a pandemic to vote. Yet those who love power more than justice got a little bit nervous and started organizing around a twisted lie and began casting it as a truth. But I ask you, how can they pledge allegiance to a nation which stands as one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all, and yet under the guise of making it easier to vote but hard to cheat, make a mockery of God by using divisible means to perpetuate an unjust status quo? Be assured, though, as my father said, evil cannot permanently organize, for it bears within its seeds seeds of its own destruction. Be assured, as Carlyle said, no lie can live forever. Be assured that truth crushed to the earth will rise again. For as James Russell Lowell reminds us, truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne, yet that scaffold always sways the future, and behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own. We shall prevail over voter suppression, and our democracy shall live because the God of justice is with us. Now, it may seem that we are in a very dark and difficult and dismal hour around voting rights. But as my mother used to always remind me, baby, the darkest hour is always before the dawn. If we continue to raise our voices in a coordinated fashion, applying all-out pressure on our president, our vice president, Senators Manchin, Senator Sinema, as well as members of the Senate, daybreak will come. How can I feel assured? Well, in November of 1956, the city officials in Montgomery brought a legal action to shut down the carpool that was the alternate form of transportation during the Montgomery bus boycott. My father and the rest of the leaders of the boycott had no backup plans to support the boycotters if the court ruled against them. Their backs were against the wall. They didn't know where to turn. Things were looking bad in the court hearing, and it was a very, very dark moment. But while sitting in the courtroom on a brief recess, there was suddenly a commotion. A reporter with the Associated Press brought a newspaper to my father, which revealed that the United States Supreme Court affirmed a decision of the U.S. District Court in declaring Alabama state and local laws requiring segregation on buses unconstitutional. So my beloved community, daybreak is on the horizon. So let's not wallow in the valley of despair, but let's keep the faith and walk together, children, and don't get weary. Organize and mobilize together, children. Don't get weary. Stand up nonviolently together, children, and don't get weary. If we got to fuss and fight, get over it together, children, and do not get weary. But let us not forget to pray together and be loved together, children, so we will not get weary. And one day we will all be able to say, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last from voter suppression, free from injustice and inequity, free from lies and half-truths. In the meantime, let us continue the movement to pressure our president, our vice president, and members of Senate to pass and sign into law the John Lewis Voter Advancement Act and For the People Act. God bless you, and let's continue the movement.
Mic check 1 2. Mic check. Mic check 1 2. Mic check 1 2. Mic check 1 2 3 4. Mic check 1 2 3 4. Mic check. Mic check. Are you gonna be standing next to her?
Will I be standing next to her? No, she will. But I'll give it to her.
Oh,
I got
no,
you.
I'll just wait till she gets up here. I just want to know who's the meeting. Okay.
I'll probably have her hold both of these, because as soon as she's done with you guys, she's gonna have to go right back in there. You have to take her. But thank you for staying. I appreciate it. I hope you guys got any water. I am sorry. We're not the ones organizing this. I apologize. would you rather?
Wiped down?
Huh?
Has it been wiped down?
That's why. Let me hold it for you.
Oh, they shoot up, right?
Yeah.
Because I'm going to keep this on my hand.
Let me put on my mask.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Is that a hey,
There you go.
you need a new phone.
I had to get a new one. Is there?
You said you had to.
is joking about my phone.
Yeah, you need to get a new one.
Alrighty.
Yeah, it's cracked.
It's very cracked.
Alrighty.
How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you all?
Good, good. Can you just reflect on, 58 years after, and we're still talking about voting rights. How are you reflecting on that?
You know, it's really frustrating that we're at this place. But in spite of that, I'm encouraged about the level of consciousness and coalition building that's happening around this nation, not just around voting rights, but issues of social justice in a way that I haven't seen it since my early adult life when we were dealing with apartheid. And so, although we're at this place and literally fighting for our democracy, as I said in my presentation, my mother said about the darkest hour being before the dawn, I know that daybreak will come in this issue because I see the energy and the focus and the concentration of people. And, you know, the more we keep pressure on, it's like if you keep applying pressure, and the more pressure that you put at a place, it begins to release something. And we don't know when, but it's going to happen. I mean, if my father and them had given up after, you know, the first assault in Montgomery or the second, you know, strategy where they tried to cripple them, what we have today, we wouldn't even have. So, you know, it is frustrating, but, you know, there's a contingency of people that are determined not to give up, you know, not to turn around, and we will prevail one day.
And you were able to gather a coalition of groups, not just focused on voter rights, but unions, groups that are focused on other issues. But why center the message on voting rights? How fundamental is
Well,
that?
I mean, because, you know, our democracy, it's the place where all of us participate in all of these things that affect our lives. I mean, if we have no say-so in what happens, you know, in terms of employment, you know, in terms of health care, you know, in terms of housing, you know, the environment, then we effectively don't have a democracy. And so voting rights is essential for all of the rest of these issues. It's the very heartbeat and the soul of who we are as the United States of America. And we have been a leading country in that regard. And so we have to fight for this and preserve this for the sake of the rest of the world. Because as goes America, goes the rest of the democratic societies.
Dr. King, you talked to me the other day about pressuring the administration. How soon do you hope to maybe entertain a meeting with the Biden administration to discuss the issues with them?
Well, you know, a lot of people have been meeting with them. I'm not sure my meeting will make that much of a difference. So I can't even, you know, really answer that. What I can say is I'll keep using the means that I have and the connections that I have to let my voice and my concerns be heard in unison with the rest of the people who continue to meet. I think more importantly, we have to find a way, as I said, to maximize the pressure. If you have a senator like we do, we have two senators who support federal voter legislation. Even pressure on them to the point that they're like, okay, leave me alone, I'm working. They're working on the other senators because they're physically up there with them when they're in session. You know, they're the ones that are going to have those sit-down conversations with Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema, and everything that the poor people's, I'm trying to get the formal name of Reverend Barbara's organization, everything that they're doing in West Virginia to bring pressure is so important. So we've got to start thinking about creative and new forms of civil disobedience. You know, in '67, my father really talked about the fact that we were moving into new stages of civil disobedience in our society, and he encouraged it. And he said we may have to disrupt some things. You know, we've seen attempts at that historically. When I say historically, in the last 10 years, with young people, and we're going to have to be more strategic with where do we shut down to get people's attention, because too many people are still sleeping on this issue because they think it's just a black issue or a brown issue or just activists complaining. No, this is the lifeline of our very democracy, and what they think is black people today will affect them tomorrow. You know, it's not like that saying, I don't know all of the different communities, but when they came for one community and they came for another community, came for another community, nobody ever, answered. And then by the time they came for you and your community, there was nobody there to speak up. And so this belongs to all of us. This is an inclusive issue. This is not a Republican, Democrat issue. This is an issue about justice. This is an issue about righteousness. And this is an issue about the lifeline of who we are as citizens of the United States of America and the globe.
Any more questions?
Thank you, Dr.